The media loves a good health villain. In the past, we have seen the fear of carbohydrates, gluten, and ultra-processed food instilled in us, and these days, glucose levels have gone from something only those with a diagnosed medical condition ever think about to a widespread obsession. Continuous blood glucose monitoring and avoiding glucose spikes has taken the health and well-being space by storm, and there are numerous companies now selling these wearable monitoring devices, and even anti-glucose spike supplements are being offered to the masses. Is this legit health advice or just another substanceless fad? Hi, I'm Serena, a surgical trainee doctor working in the NHS in the UK, and I find myself living in a time where I'm being asked about all sorts of healthcare advice in areas that, to be honest, I don't know a lot about. But I do possess a very specific set of skills, basically being a massive healthcare nerd, which allows me to dig through the sheer volume of information we are being given through social media, on our phones, and on the headlines, and dig through to find out what evidence there is and what the evidence actually says. We will be talking about normal blood sugar physiology, then I'll talk about abnormal blood sugar pathology, before moving on to the need for continuous blood sugar monitoring in non-diabetic, otherwise healthy adults, and whether it's something we actually need. As with most healthcare content online, this is not personalized medical advice. So let's start with normal blood sugar control. When you eat something, your blood sugar levels will rise, and the beta cells in your pancreas will produce a hormone called insulin. Insulin will help to lower your blood sugar levels back down to a normal range by taking the excess glucose or sugar in your blood and storing it as glycogen in your liver and muscles. When your blood sugar levels are low, say you haven't eaten anything for a while, or you have an increased demand because you are suddenly exercising or something, then the alpha cells in your pancreas will detect this and will produce a hormone called glucagon. This will take the stored version of glucose in your muscle and liver, the glycogen, and release it back as glucose into your bloodstream so your body can use it, and therefore restoring your blood glucose levels back to that normal range. Glucose is needed by every single cell in the body to perform our daily biological processes, and so too little or too much can cause potential harm. Therefore, in individuals with a normal functioning pancreas, those alpha and beta cells are detecting your glucose levels constantly and fine-tuning them to ensure your glucose levels are always in a normal range. Blood sugar fluctuations within that normal range is normal and non-pathological, and so not a sign of disease. However, there are conditions where your blood sugar levels can be pushed into ranges outside of these normal levels and therefore be at pathological levels, aka levels that indicate disease. Abnormal blood sugar control. When you eat something and your blood glucose levels rise, your pancreas should produce an appropriate amount of insulin that restores your blood glucose levels to a normal, safe range. When there is a fault in this system, this usually results in diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is when the body does not produce enough or any insulin. This is usually an autoimmune condition that occurs in individuals from childhood because there is some autoimmune destruction of these beta cells in the pancreas, which means that you're not able to produce the insulin that your body needs to restore your blood glucose levels to normal, and so your glucose levels will remain abnormally high. And these people usually need to take an external source of insulin to replace the insulin that your body is no longer producing. Type 2 diabetes is less well understood, but thought to be a disease of insulin resistance, where your pancreas is still producing the insulin you need, unlike in type 1. But in type 2, your body is not responding to the insulin as it should, and so your glucose levels are not lowering as they should and remaining abnormally and chronically high. Type 2 diabetes usually develops much later on in life in adulthood, and risk factors include things like obesity, sedentary lifestyle, as well as genetic factors. but there is a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. We have been talking about normal fluctuations in blood glucose and abnormal fluctuations, and how do we decide what is normal and what is not? Well, within medical practice, we have some pretty standardized values, and I think it's worth quickly discussing these values in order to discuss the rationale behind blood glucose monitoring later on. The first measure to discuss is fasting blood glucose, which, as the name suggests, is the blood sugar levels when you've not eaten for a while, so usually after about 8 to 10 hours of not eating anything. In a normal non-diabetic adult, a value of less than 6 millimoles per litre is normal glycemic control. A level of over 7 is indicative of diabetes, and between this, so within the range of 6.1 and 6.9, is thought to be a pre-diabetic stage, which is an intermediate stage, which is recognized as having the potential to develop into diabetes if blood sugar levels continue to not be controlled. The second measure is the oral glucose tolerance test, or OGTT. This is where an individual is given a measured standardized amount of glucose, and their blood sugar levels are measured 2 hours later. A value of less than 7.8 indicates normal glycemic control. A value over 11.1 will indicate a diagnosis of diabetes, and between this, so 7.8 to 11.1, puts you in that pre-diabetic range. We also have a very interesting measurement called HbA1c, which is glycolated hemoglobin, in other words, sugary red blood cells. If you have chronically or long-term high glucose levels, then over time, the hemoglobin proteins in your red blood cells, which carry oxygen around your body, will get coated in glucose as well. What is very cool about HbA1c, or cool if you're a nerd like me, is that the lifespan of our red blood cells are about 120 days. And so your HbA1c level is not just indicating what your blood sugar control is like now, but what it's been like over the last 120 days. So it gives an indication of your long-term blood sugar control rather than just a snapshot of the day of the test alone. A value of less than 41, or 5.9% of your total hemoglobin being glycated, is normal. Over 48 or over 6.5% is indicative of diabetes, and between this, so between 41 to 47 or between 5.9 and 6.5%, is in that pre-diabetic range. Also worth noting that a random blood glucose level, so not one that is taken fasting or anything, of over 11.1 is also indicative of diabetes. Let's just let that settle before we even talk about continuous blood glucose monitoring devices. If you are fortunate enough to have normal blood glucose control, then congratulations, you've got your very own internal continuous blood glucose monitoring device, and it is your pancreas, which brilliantly keeps your blood glucose levels within a normal and safe range at all times, no matter what you've eaten and what exercise you are doing. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but the majority of the time, your pancreas has got you. In diabetic individuals, pancreatic function is impaired in some way, and so you've lost this internal monitoring and this internal fine control, and so blood glucose levels can become dangerously high or even dangerously low. It is for this reason that type blood glucose control, and therefore blood glucose monitoring, is so important for diabetic individuals, and therefore recommended for this group of people as well. So now, with that basis of knowledge, I wanted to move on to the crux of this video, and that is answering the question, do non-diabetic adults need continuous blood glucose monitoring? To answer this question, I had to look at the devices out there on the market and see what they were claiming to do for its users. Across all the websites I came across, there were claims about these devices improving your health, your energy levels, sleep, mood, focus, but essentially what they are claiming to do for you, a non-diabetic user, boils down to a few key fundamental concepts which must be true and evidence-backed in order to make this a safe and worthwhile investment for you and your health. Number one, we all differ in our blood sugar responses. A big part of the marketing and claims for these devices is that they're trying to offer more personalized nutritional advice, and that suggests that we must all differ from individual to individual quite a lot to make these devices worthwhile. Different foods cause different responses to our post-meal or postprandial blood sugar levels. Foods that are high in carbohydrates that are quickly broken down by our bodies into sugars will cause quicker and higher blood sugar levels immediately after eating it. These are known as high glycemic index foods. Foods such as white bread, white rice, fizzy drinks, and conversely, foods that are broken down slowly into sugars by our bodies will be low glycemic index foods, usually whole grains, oats, pulses, lentils. Some fruits and vegetables will fall into this category. Now, it's important to know that high glycemic index foods doesn't automatically make it an unhealthy food, and a low glycemic index food doesn't automatically make it an unhealthy food. For example, foods like watermelons are very high glycemic index foods, whereas a slice of chocolate cake might be a lower glycemic index foods, but clearly they both have lots of other nutritional benefits and drawbacks. So we know that different foods cause varying blood glucose responses, but what about between different people? If I was to eat something and another person was to eat the same thing, would our blood sugar levels vary between each other? In this study of 800 healthy non-diabetic adults in Israel, individuals were asked to wear continuous blood glucose monitors for 1 week, and data was collected about their blood sugar responses, as well as other data about their food, their lifestyle, and their gut microbiome. Their results showed high variability in blood sugar responses to the same food. So for example, participant 445 showed a higher blood sugar level in response to bananas than cookies in the first hours after eating them, whilst participant 664 showed the opposite, with a higher response to cookies than bananas. Using this data, they created an algorithm which would take a food item and predict the blood glucose response an individual would have to that food, and then recommend them a personalized nutrition plan which would help to reduce their blood sugar variability. Now, whether blood glucose variability is something that we should be working towards optimizing for health reasons is something I will discuss shortly. For now, let's look at what we can or can't conclude from this paper. Firstly, this algorithm was put to the test and compared with diet advice from diet experts, and it was found that the algorithm reduced post-meal blood glucose levels by about 46%, whereas the expert-based diet advice reduced it by 44%. So I'm not sure how much this algorithm added on top of current health practices and advice and information that we already have in place. Secondly, although yes, this paper did show that there was a lot of differences between the blood sugar response of one person compared to another person to the same stimuli, so there was a lot of inter-person variability, there was no comment made on whether the same person would respond to the same stimuli in different ways depending on other factors, and so whether there was a lot of intra-person variability. We know our personal blood sugar responses to food can vary a lot from one day to the next. So me eating a bowl of pasta now and then eating the exact same bowl of pasta in a week could garner some very different blood sugar responses, and we know this could be based on numerous other factors such as the amount of sleep I've had, or the amount of exercise I've done, or the time of day that I'm eating. And so without all of this context, in a non-diabetic individual, your postprandial blood glucose level is a number, and just a number really. Without any meaningful context, we can't really interpret this number in a very meaningful way. And in actual fact, if you see that a food causes a certain response, say quite a high sugar response one day, you might be writing that food or food group out of your diet completely, when it could have caused a completely different response the next day or the next week. And what a sad existence I would now be living without pasta. The next concept to explore is that reduced blood glucose levels must always be better. In a non-diabetic individual, your blood sugar levels will be fluctuating within a normal range throughout the day based on numerous factors that we've already discussed. So if your body is doing this continuous monitoring for you, then do we need external devices doing this monitoring for us and telling us that we are in the normal range, but that we should be aiming for lower? This meta-analysis looked at papers looking at the association between HbA1c, oh my god, is it 1AC or A1C? I've just realised it's HbA1c, and I've been saying HbA1c, I think, for the beginning of this video, and also for all of my medical career, I think. Maybe I'm overthinking it and I was always saying it right, but I've just changed today. Anyway, so going back, looking at this meta-analysis, which was looking at the association between HbA1c and mortality or death, we can find out a few interesting things. This study looked at 12 different papers, all looking at the link between HbA1c levels and all-cause mortality, which is death from any causes, as well as cardiovascular mortality, so death from any diseases of the heart, and cancer mortality. So using data from all of these papers, they have produced this graph, which on the x-axis is showing the HbA1c levels, and on the y-axis is the hazard ratio. So for simplicity's sake, how hazardous these HbA1c levels are to your mortality, how likely you are to die. So the meta-analysis concluded the dose-response curves were relatively flat for HbA1c less than 5.7% and rose steeply thereafter. If we look back at our table of blood glucose levels, we can see that a HbA1c percentage of 5.9% or less is considered normal. And so that suggests in those of us who have normal blood sugar control, aiming for lower levels within the normal range doesn't really have any suggested health benefits for us. And so we have established that we all have different blood sugar responses, both between different individuals and both within ourselves in response to the same stimuli based on numerous other factors. We've established that being in the normal range of blood sugar levels is good, but being lower within that normal range doesn't seem to have any health benefits for us. But the third and final key assumption that I think the continuous blood glucose monitoring device companies appear to make or appear to suggest is that reducing our blood glucose fluctuations throughout the day is a good thing, and so reduced glucose variability or avoiding these glucose spikes is something we should be aiming towards. Glucose spikes is a phrase I keep seeing touted all over the internet like the spawn of Satan, and something we should all be actively trying to avoid at all costs. What is a glucose spike, and more importantly, what do these spikes mean for our health, is quite difficult to define. We know that our glucose levels rise after eating most foods, some foods with high glycemic index more than others with low glycemic index. But we know this is a normal response rather than a pathological response. And so is there any merit to avoiding these rises? In this paper from Denmark, 5,861 non-diabetic adults had an oral glucose tolerance test, and after being given a standardized glucose dose, their glucose levels were measured at 0 minutes, 30 minutes, and 120 minutes. This revealed 4 distinct glucose patterns seen in these individuals. Group 1 had normal levels at 30 minutes and normal levels at 2 hours. Group 2 had normal levels at 30 minutes, but raised levels at 2 hours. Group 3 had raised levels at 30 minutes, but went back down to normal by 2 hours. And Group 4 had raised levels at 30 minutes and raised levels at 2 hours. The participants were followed up for 13 years, and it was found that all-cause mortality was significantly higher in Groups 3 and 4, those who had elevated glucose levels at 30 minutes. And also in Group 3, where they had elevated levels at 30 minutes, which returned to normal by 2 hours, there was an increased risk of developing diabetes later on. This certainly raises some very interesting questions for scientists and clinicians. Currently, the oral glucose tolerance test, which we use to help diagnose diabetes, measures the glucose levels 2 hours after the initial glucose load is ingested. But this study, and other studies like it, suggest that an earlier peak, as early as 30 minutes, could be measured, and this could actually be a predictor of disease development of diabetes later down the line. But as far as putting this in the context of our normal daily glucose fluctuations, which see our glucose levels go up and down day in, day out, it's very, very difficult to determine what is a pathological glucose spike and what is part of just a normal glucose fluctuation. This all requires a lot more work, a lot more context, and a lot more interpretation than the average person measuring their blood sugar levels constantly at home through a home device could possibly do at this point. And I guess this brings me on to drawing some conclusions about continuous blood glucose monitoring devices. Does a non-diabetic, otherwise healthy individual need one? An important reason that I don't believe we do need one is that more data data is not always good data. There is no doubt that we are living in a time where we are all obsessed with data, tracking, and taking control of our lives, especially our health. But data should involve meaningful interpretation, which results in actionable information. Without that, it's not really data, it's just numbers. And I think tracking our blood glucose levels and its normal ups and downs day in and day out just gives you a bunch of numbers without any context or interpretation may lead to doing more harmful behaviors than good. This leads me on to the second disadvantage, tunnel vision. The foods we eat have numerous effects on our body, and the blood sugar response is just one small, tiny piece of the puzzle that is nutrition and health. If you're only looking at this one marker, it may cause you to swap out something like an apple, which causes a high sugar rise, for something like a greasy burger, which didn't cause as much of a sugar rise in you, and you may be eliminating foods or entire food groups for something else which may not necessarily be healthier for you in the first place anyway. Next disadvantage is the psychological impact. Constant monitoring of our food can cause a lot of anxiety and even avoidant and disordered eating behaviors, all of which can have very negative effects on the rest of our mental and physical health. It goes without saying that health needs to be addressed holistically, and I don't think we're very good at that as a healthcare service. But I don't think that monitoring or fixating on particular components of food is going to get us there in a better way. Finally, lack of evidence. There is a lack of evidence base in whether these devices are useful in their monitoring, whether they provide to be useful in terms of interventions for preventing future disease. The evidence so far shows there are clear negative outcomes of chronically elevated blood glucose levels. But whether we need to reduce our normal fluctuations or reduce levels within the normal range is not yet looking that promising. However, there is clearly a grey area between those who have completely normal and healthy glucose responses and those who are in the diabetic range. There is clearly a group of people in the middle who may be showing earlier signs of impaired glucose tolerance than what we are measuring or picking up currently. And I really welcome good quality research and evidence in this area. But what doesn't sit well with me is that the continuous blood glucose monitoring companies, a lot of them are funding or running their research with their devices, and this kind of bias and conflict of interest is usually a big no-no in the medical community. We need some impartial trials and we need some impartial evidence to understand how we can detect things quicker, what is a safe way to detect these things, what are safe interventions, and only once we have that good impartial evidence base can we start recommending these devices, even prescribing these devices or other similar interventions. And what worries me right now is the use of these devices is already being mass marketed and mass sold without the evidence there. In terms of advantages of tools like this, I can definitely see potential advantages in being able to offer more personalized advice, being able to understand our bodies and our responses to certain things on a much more personalized level. And I welcome future research in this area that is meaningful and safe and applicable to the people who need it the most. My overall message is that food is fuel, food is enjoyment, food is nourishment, and I think an existence where we are all monitoring the blood glucose levels different foods give us seems like quite a miserable existence to me and not really conducive to good health outcomes, however you want to define that. But of course, watch this space and I look forward to seeing what else we discover in this area. But for now, I will not be recommending these devices to anyone I know. If you enjoyed this video, then check out this video where I deep dive into the evidence base, looking at whether female surgeons are better than male surgeons. If there are other topics you want me to look into, please comment down below and I'll see you in a future video. Bye!